Good afternoon, good evening, good morning to those in Australia. Good morning. Thank you for being here. Today we have with us in the Explorers of the International Federation for Public History, Professor Chris Houston. We are very grateful, Professor Houston, for you accepting our invitation. Today's event it's going to be an interview with our three interns that I will introduce in a moment, and Professor Houston. Today's event is called Politics, Nationalism, and Memory in Turkey. And for those who already know me, I'm Jimena Perry. I'm going to be your host and the project manager for the Explorers of the International Federation for Public History. Welcome. The project manager for the Explorers of the International Federation for Public History. So Chris Houston arrived at Macquarie University in 2005 after teaching anthropology for 3 years at the University of Canterbury in New Zealand. In the anthropology program at Macquarie University, he teaches political anthropology, urban anthropology, the anthropology of art, while also co-convening with some of the core units of the Master's Research in Anthropology. In his teaching, Professor Houston engineers a meeting between more abstract social theory and particular ethnographic interpretation and representation. At the moment, he's interested in the broad areas of anthropology of the city, the politics of and lived experience of Islam, and in the potential of people to alter themselves through a range of modalities such as political activism, art and craft, religion, and self-help projects. All of these interests have been fostered by his fieldwork in the city of Istanbul, where he has lived on and off for a number of years. Istanbul is the base of his ongoing study of Islamic and secular social movements in Turkey, in which Professor Houston explores the ways Islam in the Turkish context has been organized and practiced. His years in Turkey and other places have also encouraged his interest in republicanism, nationalism, and literature, as well as how the organization of space and architecture are connected with these political practices. Thank you, Professor Houston, for being here. Our interviewers are going to be Hamish McLean. He's a third-year undergraduate student at Macquarie University. His studies have focused on prehistory, and he wishes to learn how we can use stories from all periods to help people today. This has led him into study of media creation and the ways in which people communicate. Hamish is also part of the interns working with the Explorers Project this semester. There's also with Ashley Morgan. She's a disabled early career researcher from Australia. She's currently undertaking an internship with the International Federation of Public History Explorers program as part of her studies at Macquarie University, where she's undertaking a Bachelor of Ancient History with a specialization in ancient languages. She's also currently studying biological anthropology as part of a Master's of Archaeological and Evolutionary Science with the Australian National University, having completed a Bachelor of Arts in 2019 from the University of Wollongong, where she majored in modern history and ancient history and archaeology. In addition to her studies, she's also currently involved with the archaeogaming community and has presented her research within this field to both national and international audiences. And last but not least, we have Megan Jones. She is in her final year of a Bachelor of Ancient History, majoring in Languages and Cultures of Ancient Egypt and the Near East at Macquarie University. She has had a particular passion for ancient Egypt since she was very young, and is interested in going to museum work and eventually secondary school teaching. As Hamish and Ashley, Megan is part of the Macquarie University students, part of the internship program for the Explorers. So thank you, Hamish, Megan, and Ashley also for this interview. And before kicking off the interview, I would like to ask our guest, Professor Houston, just to talk a little bit about himself. When did his interest in Istanbul started? How did he reach those big questions that he has worked on, and how does he see himself like within the field? So the floor is yours, Professor Houston.
Thanks, Jimena. And thanks to Megan in particular, I think, for inviting me to speak in the project or the Federation for Public History, which actually, to be honest, I hadn't heard of before Megan told me about it. And now that I have heard of it, I think, oh, what a great initiative. And I intend to keep on following up and joining in with things. Because I guess I hadn't really thought of it, but in one way, maybe my research has been public history as well. I mean, I could reconfigure it like that. So I think the question was, how did I get interested in Turkey or Istanbul? It was pure chance. I ended up backpacking after I finished university and ended up in Istanbul. I'd probably run out of money. I can't exactly remember now why it was that I applied for a job to teach English without a proper teaching qualification. But the school said, well, if you have a university qualification, you can come and teach English. So I did that badly for a couple of years. And as you would when you're like 24 years old, I think I fell in love with someone, had to come back to Australia, took her, and then it was going to take a while to get back to Istanbul. And I thought actually the best way would be to start a PhD in anthropology, because then I could go back to Istanbul and live there for a couple of years again on the scholarship. So yeah, it took a while for all that to get organized. And I went back to Turkey in 1994. 1994 to 1997 was quite a long time. So 2.5 years I did field work. And yeah, so that's how the interest sort of came about by chance. And then of course, because Istanbul is such an incredible city on the one hand, I mean, I sometimes think there's maybe 3 cities in the world which are similar, big for different reasons. They're like Rome, Beijing, and Istanbul, because they're all the centers of this incredible imperial histories. Which have all now been transformed and yet both in the built environments and somehow or other in certain sort of long-term historical understandings and of people who live there, reproductions of things, they still have sort of some links in a strange way to these very different histories. So when you go to Istanbul and you look at the amazing mosques on the 7 hills, I mean, there's more mosques than that, of course. It's amazing. And then on top of that, Istanbul has had a phenomenal history just in the last 100 years, from 1923, when Mustafa Kemal and the Turkish nationalists sort of established the new state of Turkey and didn't make Istanbul the capital very deliberately, but went out into the middle of nowhere and set up Ankara, a bit like Canberra or Washington. But for very clear reasons. Of course, all the bureaucrats living in Istanbul in 1922, 1923 thought it was their worst nightmare to have to go and live in Ankara. It was just a building site for like 20 years. But so Istanbul, then it was sort of overshadowed by what was happening with the Turkish Republic. But of course, it's the biggest, most important, significant city in Turkey. So yeah, there's just so many issues that come out of studying what has always been a big city, some at different times the biggest in the world, and it was under the Ottomans in the 16th or 17th century. And now a mega city, 20 million people. I mean, it's hard to know where Istanbul stops in its boundaries, but imagine what's going on in a city of 20 million people. So yeah, I think that's sort of the background about why it's so interesting to do research in Turkey, but in Istanbul in particular.
Thank you, Professor Houston. Hamish, the floor is yours.
Well, I know I'm putting you on the spot here straight away, but I thought maybe you could give us a bit of an overview of like the social movements within Turkey that you've been studying, especially like Kemalism, which I don't think many people have a good idea about. Yeah,
so this is the $1 million question. In a way, it's like, what's the modern history of the political institutions in Turkey? So, as you said, Hamish, Kemalism is just the word that comes from Mustafa Kemal, who was the name of the first president and the leader of the national movement. I mean, it's a bit like Leninism or something. So that's why it's called Kemalism. If we wanted to be a bit more historical, which I know that you students would actually, we would trace it back a little bit earlier than 1923 under the Young Turks, because Mustafa Kemal was actually a member of a not so important member of the Young Turks. But it's interesting, in Australia, we first hear of Mustafa Kemal, or Ataturk as he took the name later, because he was the leader of the Turkish forces at Gallipoli. So it's interesting. In Australia, for people who care, he's sort of a significant figure, not because of what he did in Turkey, but because he was also involved in, in defending the Ottoman Empire against the invasion of the British and Australian, New Zealand forces. So if we don't go back there, 1923, the Ottoman Empire sort of collapses from an internal coup. And that's one interesting thing. It wasn't a colonial movement that destroyed the Ottoman Empire. It never lost sovereignty right up until 1923. We can say it was an internal movement, which is really hard to put your finger on exactly what it was, which deposed the Sultan, expelled him from Istanbul, made museums of the palaces. And the ideology of that movement could be called Kemalism. So that has been the dominant political ideology in Turkey ever since 1923. And if we want a really shorthand definition, what is Kemalism? I would say, one, it's authoritarian. So it's very undemocratic. That's the first thing. It never allowed elections until 1950. So Turkey was a single party regime. I mean, Kemalists don't like it if you call it a dictatorship, but of course it was. From 1923 to 1938, and Mustafa Kemal was the president, but not having any elections. It was a dictatorship, but that's not the official way of talking about Kemalism. But we can say it's authoritarian, A. B, it's modernist. So it's modernizing politics and state. It's got control of the state. So it's a modernizing state, and that's a bit, what that means is really interesting. And then the third one is it's Turkish nationalist. And that's the really important one for Istanbul. I mean, they're all important for Istanbul, but why it's important, Hamish, is because in 1923, Istanbul's a multi-religious city.
Yeah.
Full of Greeks, full of Armenians, full of Jews, and different even denominations within those ethnic religious categories. 40% of the population is non-Muslim in 1923. So we can say it's incredibly important to understand that history of Istanbul from 1923, let's say up to 1960. There's lots of ways of talking about the history of the city and of Kemalism, but that Turkish nationalist part of it has meant the expulsion of the minorities, religious minorities, out of Istanbul. I think the latest figure is like there may be 98% of Istanbul is Muslim of different types, but religious and irreligious. And there's a tiny proportion of non-Muslims living in the city. And that's a really big difference from the Ottoman period. So when I think what is Kemalism, I think one, it's a very ferocious Turkish nationalism. Two, it's a very modernizing ideology, which means some other things. It's sort of anti-religious if it thinks that religion and modernity are opposed to each other. And the third one is it's been very authoritarian because it comes out of the military. So Mustafa Kemal was a soldier. And that's probably why we've also had a military coup in 1960, a military coup in 1971, a military coup in 1980, the biggest one, which I had been researching, a forced deposition of the government in 1997, where basically the military council said to the government, we're not happy with what you're doing. We will do a coup unless you resign. So that's called the postmodern coup. But they managed to do a coup without actually moving the tanks on the street. And then we've seen an attempted military coup in 2016, which has had really drastic consequences in the last 5 years in terms of a new authoritarian constitution in response. So actually, what is Kemalism? You might also say it's really closely connected to a glorification of the Turkish military as well, which in the constitution, of course, is it's an offense to criticize the military in Turkey.
Oh my God.
You can be taken to court if you, try to do a deconstruction of the military history of the Republic.
Well,
That's
just
a very long-winded answer. Sorry.
yeah, no, I was going to say for such a complicated topic, you've done an amazing job there. Just along that modernism line, though, I think it's very interesting that Istanbul is such a religious city. And does Kemalism define itself as secularist? Would it say it's non-religious, or?
Yeah, it's another really great question. So in 1923, and I think Megan knows about this, so I probably made her read about it. The Kemalists never actually declared that their regime was secularist. They had another word, which was a French word, and they also Turkified it. So actually what they called the regime was laicist. So that already tells you, because secularism isn't that clear and there's different varieties of it, that it's somehow much more closely related to French, the way that the French state regulates religion, than it is the way that the American or the Australian state sort of doesn't regulate religion, but has a sort of a separation. So that's one thing. You can see that it's not a separation of state and religion in religious institution where it's live and let live, and there's a constitutional type of arrangement where each of them has protection against the other one in some ways. It's much more like the Turkish Republic will heavily control what it allows religious institutions to do, what it will allow them to preach, how it will control the mosque. So yeah, I personally would never use the word secularism for Turkey. Apart from the issue of translation, lots of Kemalists want to keep on claiming that the state is secular, but they're not using it in the same way that is the more normative definition. So that's is it secular? Actually, no, it's not secular at all. What it is state control of religion. And that is really incredible, the way that Turkey has, under the Kemalists, controlled religion. I mean, the first thing that it did is that it made every employee in the mosque a bureaucrat who's employed by the state ministry of religion. So that's how it controlled it, by making everyone a bureaucrat and paying their salaries, and then saying this to get accredited. This is the course, the theology course. It's a state accredited theology course. So on every level, Turkish Islam is heavily curtailed by the state. So yeah, is that secularism? Yeah. I don't think so. Is there an antagonism, a modernist antagonism between religion and sort of modernism in Kemalism? I mean, there is, because they don't like religion in a way, but there isn't because they've taken such care to foster a certain type of Islam in Turkey. So no, it's a good flexible formula. Basically, when they want to, they can suppress something and go, this is beyond the bounds of Turkish Islam. And at another time, they can say against communism or against leftist politics, they can go, we really think that, that's a godless type of movement, and we're not like that in Turkey. We want people to be proper pious Muslims, etc. So
that's
it's
so
confusing.
Well, I'm bringing it more back to you then. What has been the function of, what have you been doing within that environment? What has been your role?
Okay, so I said I went to Turkey in 1994. I did have a project then. It was because of this amazing event that happened in 1994. In 1994, for the first time ever, an election was held at the council level, and a party that was not in, was a sort of this is tricky, a sort of a religious party within the Turkish context, actually won Istanbul. And of course, it gave, so there is a level of democracy in Turkey. Where there's a level of democracy is at the council level elections. The higher state elections are a bit different. They don't have a state system, you don't have like the US or Australia. So the two levels of sort of representation are at the federal, no, the state level at the top, and then the councils. And it's like London, there is a greater municipality of Istanbul. And so when the Religious Party won that in 1994, that actually became my topic. I went to Istanbul and thought, okay, what would a religious party, so I don't know, Muslim friendly, it's really hard to, I mean, I wouldn't call them Islamist, a Muslim friendly party in the Turkish context of this history, what would they do when they got control of the city hall? So yeah, that was the project then. That was great. I did 2 years of research going into all the different civil society stuff that there was a huge amount of things on Islam and modernity, Islam and gender, Islam and the family. Just coming from a huge different lot of groups, there was a real big movement from below. And it was great doing that fieldwork. But the other thing, and then I won't talk too much, is that really quickly there developed a big split in that movement. And now it comes onto something I haven't really spoken about. So Turkish Muslims and Kurdish Muslims within that religious movement began to have a really big fight over the Kurdish issue. Okay, so I haven't spoken about the Kurdish issue, but no, Turkey, it sort of goes back to the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire was multi-religious. We've already spoken about that. It was also incredibly multicultural. And it had numerous languages spoken within it. It had numerous types of Islam, numerous types of Sharia. It was a really complicated society. Turkish nationalism, Kemalism, is a very simplistic, modernizing one. It basically said the state of Turkey is for Turks. If you're not and Turkish Muslims, if you're not a Muslim, it's going to be you're a problem for us, and will be a problem for you. The end result has been population transfer and all of that with Greece. But it's been a really big problem for Muslims who are not Turkish. And the biggest group of Muslims in Turkey who are not Turkish is Kurds living in the eastern part of Turkey. So that part of Turkey has actually been under martial law since 1923. There's been like 4 or 5, which is both appalling, terrible, and also terrible that no one in the rest of the world cares or knows about the situation there because of the power, I reckon, of the romantic idea of Kemalism as this political movement that put Islam in its place, secularized Turkey, democratized it against the autocratic Ottoman Empire, blah, blah. You can see the narratives, powerful modern narratives they can utilize. But the Kurdish people are Muslims, of course. That government was very Turkish oriented. And there was a huge split in that period that I was looking at. So that actually became then the focus of part of my work thereafter was Turkish nationalism. Is Turkish nationalism in Islam? Now, why does a religious movement that should be multicultural, why isn't it in Turkey? Why is it Turkish chauvinist? And that connects into the state control of Islam and all of that stuff. So yes, then I can say, ever since that research, those strains have sort of kept on coming back. Islam, political Islam, multiculturalism in Islam, problems of ethnic domination within Islamist movements, Kemalism, nationalism, modernism, and political democratizing movements in Turkey, which come up from below of different types and have had good successes up to a point, but have had authoritarian revivals like 1980 military coup, which stopped everything for 5 years.
Well, a very simple topic then.
Yeah, that's right.
I hope this isn't too assumptive, but I'm assuming on something so complicated, there are going to be some big difficulties in actually conducting that work. Could you speak about any problems you've had in coordinating that? Yeah,
like at different times, I have been really worried about whether I might go to Turkey and I put my passport in and they go, oh, you've been black banned. Normally, it's interesting, the Turkish state doesn't do that except to journalists. And also they really, the main thing that they black ban journalists from overseas is on Kurdish stuff, because that is the sort of, they say in Turkey, the red line. That's the red line. If there's any support in journalistic articles for the Kurdish rebels, if you write about and make a sympathetic account of, that explaining why there is a massive guerrilla movement in Turkey, they'll black ban you there. But so I've never really had any issues, even though I'm writing on that, because I'm not writing as a partisan of Kurdish nationalism. I'm just really careful to try and write in a sympathetic way to the people that I'm doing research with, but not to overly make political statements like, this is what it's like to be Kurdish in Istanbul, and then make some really, just a dangerous statement that means that A, it wouldn't do anything, but B, it would mean that you'd put people in risk, or you wouldn't be able to go back to Turkey.
Yeah.
But the other thing is, I do remember in fieldwork, especially in that first fieldwork in 1996, because there was the Kurdish, the PKK, or the Kurdish guerrilla movement was huge then. They've sort of, things have waxed and waned. And I didn't really know what I was doing. I went to a funeral of a partisan who'd been murdered by the Turkish police. He'd been chucked off the stadium. He was a reporter, actually, for the Kurdish newspaper. He'd been thrown off the stadium wall. And I went to the funeral, not really thinking, and I suddenly realized I was walking down a really narrow road, because the funeral was at the bottom of the valley, the cemetery. And we were going past all the Robocops and the tanks, and I realized, oh no, there's going to be a big protest at that funeral. And they're going to arrest people, if something else. So at that point, I really panicked, and I just sort of started to walk back against the big flow with all the banners and all the chanting and down with the Turkish fascist state. And I just got, so it's not a very dramatic thing, but there's some, it's an authoritarian state. It always has been so. And it's really hard to be a protester in Istanbul. Sometimes it opens up and sometimes it's not. So protesters, of course, not me, but protesters have to be always really careful. You might have seen this year on the LGBTQI day, they just attacked all the protesters marching down the main street of Istanbul. Now, 3 years ago, that was fine. They let that march go through, and then this year, for whatever reason. So, yeah, you'd have to be careful.
Yeah, that is absolutely crazy. Along that line, you've written about the similarities and differences between fiction and anthropology, and kind of these characters that get portrayed in like oral histories and even written histories. What degree do you see to what degree do you have to perpetuate these quote characters? And to what degree do you kind of have to take a step back and examine it more anthropologically or scientifically?
Yeah, that's a really complicated question, Hamish. Not just for me, actually for everyone here.
Yeah, exactly.
If you're doing research with people, how do you write about people? And of course, when I feel like that, the sort of genre that writes in the most sophisticated way about people is fiction, because they're interested in sort of psychological motivations or phenomenological motivations. They're interested in conversation, like they're at that level of everyday life and intersubjective relationships, which academics pretend that they do stuff in, but they really love to jump out of that as soon as they can, and they'll talk about big things like I've been doing. But yeah, so, and also this is an interesting thing for anthropology. It might be for modern historians as well. I read a huge amount of Turkish novels just because I learned so much about stuff which I would never be able to do research into. I mean, you may have read or heard of Orhan Pamuk. I mean, he won the Nobel Prize, I don't know, 5 or 6, I can't remember now, years ago. He's a very obsessive Istanbul character and writer. All his novels are basically set in Istanbul, a couple somewhere else. His characters are really obsessive. They like fall in love, and but they're always in the city. So if you want to know about, what was it like to be in Istanbul in 1985, you read Orhan Pamuk and you just get a really great sense of what is it like to fall in love in Istanbul? What tea houses do you go to? What do you eat? What do people fight about? What was on the lolly wrappers? I mean, he's incredible in the ethnographic detail of the novel. So sometimes, well, I'm always really envious of that level of sort of sensitivity to everyday life, which anthropology values. But it's hard to do. And on top of that, it's hard to get it published. Like, because even if you do it, quite often journals will go, oh, can't you make this less ethnographic and more relevant to people who don't care about ethnography of Turkey or Istanbul, but tell us the biggest significance, or join it up with theoretical debates somewhere else. So it's hard to make the links, but sometimes I try. I mean, I'm a failed novelist. This is terrible to confess. I do remember after I did my honours degree, I walked out of the university and said, thank God that's over. I'm never going back to university. And I was already writing fiction and short stories. And I had a real critique of anthropology because I did honours in it. And I don't know why, but I just had been, for that semester, I'd been made to read Levi Strauss. Like, the person was a Levi Strauss expert. It is the most abstracted, crazy structuralism. It was just like, if that's what anthropology is, well, I'm definitely not doing that. So it is sort of funny how then I wrote a novel, I nearly got it published, didn't get published. I faced that issue, like, am I going to write another novel? It takes a long time to do that. If I do that, and I'm like now 30 or something, and if that novel doesn't get picked up, so I just sort of thought, which might have been foolish, that academia was a better bet because it allowed me to do different things, and anthropology is the most flexible, I reckon. I feel like that, of disciplines. So yeah, that's sort of a long story about fiction, anthropology, narrative, writing about people's lives. Yeah.
Did you have something to add, Jimena?
Yes, I was, I'm gonna be brief. I'm an anthropologist too. So I also had the same feeling with Levi Strauss. I read it once for a coursework and I have never read it again.
That's right.
But I agree with Chris when he says that anthropology allows you to develop certain kind of reading that will make you say what you want to say and also respect the people you work with. For instance, I'm thinking about my own work. I work with victims of the armed conflict in Colombia, the survivors of massacres and genocide. It's very hard to write about them because, I mean, there's a lot of pain there. So many times I have been confronted with people that tell me their stories and tell me, but we don't want you to tell them. We don't want you to write them. This is only for you.
Yeah.
What do I do with that? Well, I don't tell them. And all the project goes to hell, I don't care. So it's just like a very big sense of ethics, but I think literature allows you to do some kind of writing, perhaps using inspiration on stories you cannot tell and recreating them in another way. And I found also that literature gives you a lot of tools that can improve your writing. This was also a comment, and that's it.
No, and poetry as well. I mean, I don't know, we have had Michael Jackson in the department on and off, so we've had a really good relationship with him. He's a very famous anthropologist, but he's a really famous poet. I mean, he's a novelist, but I used to teach in the anthropology of art, anthropoetry. So basically this is hard to do, make students write poetry, but not like about necessarily what they're feeling or something, but about doing field work and then recounting it in bad poetry, which is fine. So yeah, you do genre experiments to see how you can get people to write about something, as you said, Jimena, in different ways, different narratives. things that are really sensitive that you just can't write about otherwise, or just you can't. Yeah.
That is, yeah, that's so interesting. I know this is a little off topic. We did have a question in the Twitch chat. What interesting perspective, what comments can you make about the distance between your reading of Turkish fiction and what you find / discover in the course of your research? How do these two aspects impact each other?
So that's a really good question. Fiction, Turkish fiction, and no, that's a broad, huge, lots of different novels on different topics and all that. How does it relate to, I mean, it's a poetical genre, fiction. So it's a distillation, and it's a really careful crafting of things. It's not like a photograph, which anyway, that is a problem as well. It's really hard to just capture reality as it is. I mean, maybe it's not possible. So fiction is not social life, but then neither is anthropology or history. So once we take that, then I reckon that fiction can be just appreciated as a very sophisticated and nuanced, at a minor level of people's lives, issues. But because fiction can scale up to politics, it can be about politics, or it being really gesturing and making connections to broader political forces. It's not only just at the level of sort of micro intersubjectivity that fiction is illuminating. It also, you know, as Hermina could see as well with, say, Colombia or something, it can be really political. And of course, that's why sometimes states ban literature as well, because the novels are fictional, but they're so closely tied into to realities that, you know, they're worrying for states who are trying to obscure or hide stuff. So yeah, so anthropology maybe is just another genre. Maybe that's how we could say. They're all ways of trying to talk about human complexities, human conditions in particular places, because it's particular. Like being in Istanbul is not the same as being in Sydney. Fiction's really good. Of course, they're not completely different, I mean, as well, but I'm probably not answering it. But
no, I think that's a great answer, and I hope that answers your question, Aidan. I just had one. I'm conscious of time, so I'll just squeeze in one last question. Do you think it's important that your work is spread through the public humanities? To what degree do you think it's important that it's spread, and why do you think it's important it's spread?
I mean, it's interesting. Probably Hermina could talk about this as well. Well, when I started in academia, there was no such things as online profiles. I mean, and I still am like hopeless, partly because I'm hopeless at technology, partly because I just don't really like it. But I can really see, like with our graduates, the amount that the sort of the self-publicity that is demanded of people who are trying to get a job is really high. So there's a pressure to become a public intellectual. Maybe that's, or like, so to have your knowledge made public in whatever ways you can do it is a really big pressure now. And because lots of people won't get a job unless they've also got a public presence. And so, yeah, that's not the reason actually for why you'd like your work. I mean, apart from other egoistic things, which of course is important for people as well. But yeah, to the extent that your work is about public life, you'd like it to be as read, thrown into the mix of all the other stuff. Look, it's such a minor thing, academic work. And of course, probably your work in the first instance is often read by academics. But I do feel like in anthropology, that there is a potential for your work, depending on the genre you're picking. Like if you can change it into making ethnographic film or something, for that work to go much more broadly out of people who are interested even in discipline or into things who are interested in public life in Turkey. So yeah, look at it. It's really important. Like that, if everyone's writing about really important public topics.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's hard to do, and of course, there's other things you would want to be careful about what you'd want to publicize if in that arena.
Yeah, definitely. The person who wrote that question before just answered back saying thank you for such a wonderful answer. But I will hand over to Megan now, and I know we're running lowish on time. I'm sorry, Megan. And I know you have some questions.
Megan knows I'll rave on at the drop of a hat. And I don't think I ever finished a lecture in the whole course that she's just done.
It was still very fun either way. I realized that my first two questions kind of meld into each other anyway, so I think I'll just combine them a little bit. Earlier you were talking about your field work, how you went to that funeral and quickly realized you were caught up in the protest. I was just kind of wondering, what was the certain atmosphere under this Kemalism within the actual people? So you've spoken a lot about it broadly.
Yeah.
I'm kind of curious, are the people sort of exhausted with all these social movements? Have they had enough? They sort of resistant to it, or do they embrace it and think it's good that they're able to speak out within these social movements? Like, you've spoken about the Kurdish people who are obviously struggling, but more in general in Istanbul.
Yeah, look, it's a really great question. Turkey is it's a highly politicized society. That's the first thing. And that's because Kemalism is just really politicizing. It's always doing its legitimacy is based on always presenting itself as progressivist, modernist, Turkish nationalist, etc. And it's also infiltrates into all spaces. So it's hard to be apolitical in Turkey. I mean, this might be familiar with Hermina in Colombia. It's not like in Sydney where most people are apolitical, which is not a criticism. It's just that we don't need to be so political because we haven't got a state that is sort of politicizing all the time. Every education's curriculum has got Turkish nationalism things put into it. It's like, so what's it like to be in Istanbul? In the first fieldwork, I still do it now. I sometimes just get so overwhelmed by the suffering that you're hearing about, or just the drama of what's happening politically, that I just have to go and find places in Istanbul where there's sort of people aren't doing politics. And the one I found in 1997, 1988 was the metal scene. It was really big it is big in Istanbul, which is sort of interesting because Turkish Kemalism, of course, politicizes music. It bans certain types of music and it fosters other types of music. It bans certain type of instruments like the Sufi flute and never allowed it to be taught in the conservatoriums until 1980. Whereas it has its preferred type of Turkish folk music, which it knows as part of nationalism. Metal was just some genre which came into Turkey. I mean, rock music's always been pretty big in Turkey as well, but I reckon it's always been big because it could be politicized, but a lot of people just wanted a space where it was like, I don't care about the state, I don't care about politics. I'm just going to go and have a apolitical space, which is a political statement, like get out of my face, sort of to the Turkish Republic. So if that's what I feel, I reckon a lot of people feel a bit like that in Turkey. I mean, you've got a very strong Islamic movement agitating about social life, cultural practices. We shouldn't be celebrating New Year this year. New Year's is a foreign Western intervention. So many normal aspects of no, that's not the way of putting it. So many things that are normalized in Sydney are not normalized in Turkey, vice versa. So that it is really, in that regard, it's really draining living in Istanbul. Of course, you can just forget about it all and hang around with your family and that. but also there's so many forces that are impinging upon your daily life, which means that you get forced, you know, if you can't join a trade union, therefore you've got to live on the minimum wage, you actually have some reasons also for starting to look around and go, which movement's going to represent me? So yeah, it's for everyone, it's pretty exhausting. It's an exhausting city, not for tourists. I mean, that's the other thing, of course. Tourists love Istanbul, they come there, and it is a massive tourist city, millions of people, and they just think it's great. You talk to them, oh, I love Istanbul, oh, it's so fantastic, which it is as well, but it's not fantastic in that way if you're living in it.
Along those lines, I kind of had another one, I guess, within that fieldwork as well. Were you talking to a lot of Turkish people, and sort of how willing were they to talk to you about all this? Is it sort of or I can think things, but I'd rather not speak it. It's a bit dangerous, like, especially if they're sort of upset with things. Is it dangerous to sort of speak about that, or are people pretty okay?
Look, people are desperate to talk to you for a whole lot of reasons. I mean, you're an outsider, so you're not caught up in their intense kinship networks. And then on top of that, of course, Kurdish people want to talk about what's happening. Muslims want to talk about political situations. Secularists, so-called, want to talk about what the Muslims are doing. Yeah, everyone is really happy to talk about their particular position and practices and stuff. So it's a field work, if you put it like that, for field work. Sorry, it's a paradise for field work. Yeah.
And then finally, I think I'll just top it off with a very simple question, just out of curiosity. What's been your favorite or the most rewarding part of all of these studies that you've been doing?
They were all good, like the different topics and that. I mean, well, actually, you know, Megan, because I've already referenced it in the class. Okay, my family is a very religious. My father's a priest, an Anglican priest. So I find everything about Turkey interesting, but I find Islam really interesting for a whole lot of reasons. And one of the reasons is the heterogeneity in Islam is just blows your mind. I mean, it's the same in Christianity as well. And also, I mean, I'm interested in everything, but I do like to see the ways that Islam overlaps with Christianity and Judaism. I mean, how similar they are on so many different grounds. So as a sort of a way of getting students in a way to be less Islamophobic, because there's so much Islamophobia around. It's really interesting to talk about the longer histories of those religions, the incredibly close relationships they've had. I mean, as we learned in that course, Sicily, under the Muslims, lots of Muslims and Christians were intermarrying their children. The girl children became Christians and the boy children became Muslims. And it went on for 100 years of people with no type of, that's just one example of sort of the really amazing intercrossings and sort of interchanges. So I think that's just one thing, but I like to show the complexities of Islamic practices and Muslim lives. That's good. Don't know. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, that's all I thought I'd ask. So I think I'll leave it to Himina now, and she can probably finish us off with some of her own questions.
Okay, thank you, Hamish and Megan. Those were great questions. And I hear you speak, Chris. I think you have done public history without knowing it. That's what's happened with a lot of academics. They do a lot of public history, and until they know like the name, they realize, oh, I have been doing that for a while. And that's kind of exciting for me, because it means that the field is growing and I mean, like, getting stronger. I have some questions for you related to your book, the last book. Well, I don't know if it's the last book. It's a 2020 book called Istanbul, City of the Fearless. And I read the introduction, and I really found very interesting the relationship you make between activism and public spaces. And then you go on to define a concept called spatial politics. So I was wondering if you can tell us about that relationship you find between activism and public spaces. Perhaps give us an example and also talk about your own concept of spatial politics, spatial politics.
Okay, so that book, Istanbul, City of the Fearless, I think it's like urban activism,
yes,
politics and coup d'etat and memory in Turkey. So the book, in the main, it's about the 1970s in Turkey, so it's a history in that regard. I looked at lots of the archival sources, mainly newspapers and journals coming out of things. But the last third of the book is about the military coup, 1980, which stops the political movements of the 1970s, and Istanbul goes in martial law from 1980 to 1983. And that's a terrible time in Istanbul, and hundreds of thousands of people tortured, hundreds of people murdered in the prisons, lots of people exiled out of Turkey, etc. So I'm sort of looking at that. It's like a decade of politics, activism, leftist. So it was mainly leftist groups, leftist and rightist groups. So very, very strong anti-communist movements and very strong socialist movements dominating civil politics there, meaning like moving into the union movements, moving into civil society, professional associations like the architects or the engineers, professional groups. And then, of course, organizing in the huge shanty towns around Istanbul, which have started since the 1950s, the massive explosion of Istanbul as a city. Now, why that era is so interesting is partly because when the junta did the coup in 1980, they destroyed those political movements. They did 3 or 4 years of martial law, and then when they returned to a civilian so-called government with a new constitution, it was impossible to organize as a leftist political party, which is actually one of the reasons why a sort of a Muslim party started to emerge after the 1980, after that coup. So yeah, the book is really about activism in Turkey. How do you organize in the shanty towns? What do you do? What do those leftist movements, there's so many of them, they're very fractured. How did they organize sort of spatially? How did they occupy institutions? How did they educate their militants? And there was a very big movement, which, I mean, you might be familiar with in Latin America, where middle-class students, mainly students from, say, really for 5 years, 1975 to 1980, would go to the poor parts of the city, set up medical clinics, start building houses through the engineer students, this incredible sort of movement between the periphery and the center, and sort of a radicalized lower middle class, especially students, as part of the organizing of Maoist groups and socialist groups. And so you could say at the core, it was a spatial politics, like it was a transformation of Istanbul, a use of Istanbul and a transformation of it. So I guess that's what I mean by spatial politics. How do political movements from below use the city to organize their strategies? And then, of course, spatial politics has to involve how does the state from above respond? Which you could say the junta, basically occupation of city, having a what do you call it? Not a quarantine, curfew. Like a curfew so that you basically stop people moving around the city after a certain, they're all spatial strategies to sort of suppress and to demobilize the city. So yeah, by spatial politics, it's looking at how activists try and use the city, and then how the state, in response to that spatial mobilization, really did a heavy sort of authoritarian suppression. I call it like a pacification of the city,
Yes.
especially through spatial politics. Just through having a police organised everywhere, building new police stations in the shanty towns, a whole range of architectural devices, new urban planning devices, which made it easier for them to move around the city and stop any type of fantasized communes or something in the shanty towns that had already been neglected by the state, because it was the leftist groups that had started to pave the roads and bring in the plumbing and stuff. So yeah, that's sort of by spatial politics. I mean, from below, from above, activism and military activism. And actually the military is an activist force in Turkey too.
Yes, I was asking because I admire very much an Argentine sociologist called Elizabeth Jelin. I don't know if you have heard of her. She works a lot about memory and repression in the South Cone, especially in Argentina. And she started her work during the 70s, and there was a lot of social movements, students, etc. But then with the dictatorship of Videla, all that changed. And this reminds me, took me back. I mean, it reminds me a lot about all the authoritarian repression and all the murders and all the disappearances and all that happened about the dictatorship, and then how hard it has been to bounce back from that. Even the social movements from the 70s were so strong, but it has been very, very hard. And the city's changed. All the sites of torture that the military devoted to kill people and to do horrible things, they are still very, I mean, you can feel the presence in the city when you go through Buenos Aires or other cities, and even in Santiago de Chile, there's still a lot of landmarks that you can tell terrible things happen. So I think that's a very important, and actually we can use that concept also in Latin America. So I was curious about that. And,
and this is interesting. What the junta actually, for the trade union leaders, they imprisoned them. Firstly, it was in an Ottoman köşk, like a small palace in one of the main parks in Istanbul. And every year, the Revolutionary Confederation of Trade Unions does a march to that köşk, and every year they're stopped by the police. I mean, so that's sort of even though the book is about sort of memories of activism, it's actually, as you say, the commemorations, the built environment that people know about, the places of torture, of arrests and stuff. If they're not being demolished, they're still there. They've been turned into different sort of things, but people, of course, who were involved at the time know everything. So yeah, it's really, really important.
Yeah. I have another question that you might have answered before, but I'm just curious. I didn't know before this event that there had been so many attempts of coup d'etat in Turkey. And I read an article that said that the last attempt in 2016 was the most violent and most bloody, even more than the one in 1980. And I was going to ask you, what do you think about that? Is that true, or it's just because it's the last one, or because they don't know much history? Or what's your opinion about that?
Yeah, objectively, it's not true in the sense of how many people, in fact, it's so far from being true. But yeah, the reason why the AK Party has a really vested interest in claiming that exaggerating that coup. I mean, it finished in one night. It was an unsuccessful coup that finished in a night, right? There was maybe 100 people got killed, which is no bad. But it was an unsuccessful coup that finished, and then the ruling party, the AK Party, put Istanbul, whole of Turkey, under emergency law for a year. So for them, it was a godsend. I mean, but of course, they have also they've made a really big thing about how the great Turkish Muslim people stood up against the faction of the military that did the coup, and they stopped the coup. But I mean, imagine the difference. 1980, that is a full coup. It's a successful coup. It's not a faction, meaning it in the military. It's under the chain of command. It's all over Turkey. It's not in Istanbul. That coup is also just happens in Istanbul, and it leads in 3 years of martial law and a complete reorganization with a military constitution. That coup, the 2016 one, was the opportunity for the government to first defeat it, then purge the military, and then put in a new constitution themselves. So no, it's so far from being true. It's funny, but in another way, I can sort of see which groups in Turkey will make the claim that coup is really important, because it really sets up a type of new legitimacy for the AK Party, for the government.
Yeah, I thought I would ask because it was the wording of the article was pretty explicit, that they wanted to claim that 2016 was more important than 1980, and I thought that might be something behind, and yes, apparently this. So
Yeah.
thank you. Also, continuing with your book, in your book, you seem to have like a lot of interdisciplinary work, because you do history, you do ethnography, you do oral history. So I want to ask you, do you believe your work is interdisciplinary? And if so, do you find like, what kind of advantages and limitations do you find with interdisciplinary work?
Yeah. Look, it's interdisciplinary because the disciplines, they're sort of artifices of 100 years ago, almost, with the state of the knowledge and the universities at different places set up at different times, different disciplines emerge. To me, anthropology and history really should be, I wouldn't mind if I was in an anthropology history department on the one hand, because anthropology is really great at a snapshot, because that's what fieldwork sort of is really good at facilitating. But that snapshot of current life has got so many forces feeding into it. You really have to be doing history to learn about the present. So yeah, and it's interesting. Anthropology really had a rapprochement with history in the 1950s, when Evans Pritchard wrote the book, that small book, Anthropology and History. And he basically said anthropology should stop being functionalist. It should stop studying a society at a certain point in time and just looking at the internal relations. It has to have a proper historical understanding. You can see why, if there was no historical documents and sources when you went to Papua New Guinea in 1930 or something to do field work, it was hard to be historical in the way that modern historians work through archives and sources. You could do archaeology, but that was in the infancy as well. Now they should be just together. Yeah, so I reckon. And then of course philosophy is another interesting link, because anthropology is a really weird discipline in the sense that it should be historical, but it's also much more theoretical than history. And so much of the sort of theoretical, useful language for history is really coming out of anthropological investigations. But that's not to say that that's because anthropology is so great. Anthropology has an interesting relationship with philosophy and social theory, because it has the ability to go, okay, yeah, here's a theory of modernization, but that doesn't work the same in Turkey as it works in Colombia. So you really need to stop being so abstract and start moving up from the particular into the sort of theoretical domains that are of social theory. So yeah, maybe that's like my perfect anthropology would be a social theory history anthropology. And other things as well would have to come in, but
yeah, there are very few programs that I know that treat anthropology and history together. There's one in Michigan called Anthropology and History, and they are together, and people there study two things together. But I have found, for example, that anthropologists rely a lot in literature, as you say, in philosophy, in many other disciplines, and I think that makes our work like much more rich. I agree with you. And my last question would be, Chris, how do you see Istanbul today? What are your projects, new projects? How are you going to keep doing field work there?
Yeah, I am. Yeah, I'm I've been the so-called discipline chair of like the head of department of anthropology for 3 years. Thank God I'm finishing at the end of June. And I'm going to Istanbul on the 17th of June for 7 months. So I'll go and start a new fieldwork project there. It's sort of a bit of a follow-up from the last stuff about 1970s activism. So I realized that union and labor activism is really important, suppressed. So I sort of want to do labor activism in Istanbul, which I know will be a really difficult topic, but the interesting thing, and this is so typical of Turkey, there's not one union confederation in Turkey. Like, in Australia, there's the ACTU, that's the peak body, and unions affiliate into it. So there's just one peak body. In Turkey, so typical, there's three. So there's a Muslim trade union confederation, there's a nationalist one, and there's a leftist one. And different unions affiliate into them. They have different positions on striking. They have different policies around the mass collective agreements, which are heavily controlled by the state. So yeah, and then, like everywhere in the world, there's a really big proportion of the population who are not unionized in the poorest parts of the city. And on top of that, there's at least 1 million Syrian refugees living in Istanbul now. And they've probably learned Turkish, but basically, imagine for the last 5 or 6 years, 1 million people coming into Sydney with no English, and no proper welfare system, actually, desperate to take whatever shitty job you can take. So there's a huge underground workforce now in Istanbul. It's driven down wages for Turkish people as well. There's actually a really big reaction against Arabs in Istanbul, Syrians, etc. So yeah, I think I'll just dip my toe in the water because 7 months isn't really long enough, but I hope I'll go back again over the next 4 or 5 years. I figure that's how long the project will take. Yeah, okay. So it's Istanbul, it's urban, political movements, activism, Islamic unionism, whatever that means, I've got to find out.
Well, good luck. It sounds really, really interesting. Hamish or Megan, do you have like a last question or a follow-up question or a final comment?
No questions. I'm sure I'll think of some when I'm having a shower tonight, and I'll think, oh damn, should I ask that? But no, just thank you so much. This has been so fantastic.
Yeah, I'll just add on to that. I had no idea that you were leaving. It makes me a little sad because I really like this subject that I did this semester with you inspired me to go do another anthropology unit because I really enjoyed it. Really liked how it sort of, because I am a history student, I really enjoyed how it challenged my brain in a different way. But yeah, thank you so much for doing this. Thank you so much for the semester. It's been really good to hear a lot more about what you've actually done because we get to hear a little bit about it in the subject this semester. But that's the whole point of why I wanted you to come do this is from what I heard, I was like, that sounds really cool and I'd love to hear more about it. Yeah, no, thanks so much. It's always a pleasure to talk about Istanbul and Turkey and Ottoman stuff because the Ottomans were really cool guys too. There's a lot I mean, it's hard to do Ottoman history in Australia. I don't even know whether there's any Ottoman studies departments here, but it's a huge area in Europe and the US, of course. I think the modern history department might touch on it because I've done a couple of modern history units. I think they do it very briefly, like a little bit of it. It's definitely not like a major or anything, I don't think, that you'd be able to do. No, because you'd have to learn Ottoman Turkish, which is part of that degree. Everyone learns it when they're doing it. But yeah, here I don't think you could do the history of it properly. Yeah, I think the most I've encountered is about a week or two within a world history class. Right. Yeah. Wow. I mean, it's really amazing. Like this is sort of interesting. In Turkey at the moment, there's a really heavy repression of sort of LGBTQ politics, and it's being done by a sort of a religious government,
and it's being done partly in the name of Islam. But of course, no, if you don't need to do too much research to look at sexuality and gender and sort of those topics under the Ottomans to see that the way of being Islam had no problems with a much really different type of sexual practices. So, I mean, I just think even on that, it's so typical that Islam now is so puritanical and so modernist, and so in its sort of distinctions and so purist. Islamic movements, they're so purist, whereas historic Islam has been so far from that in terms of drug taking and alcohol and or everything.
Yeah.
That's just an interesting thing.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Chris, for accepting the Explorers invitation. It was really a fantastic session. I learned so much. It was really, really very, very engaging. I want to thank Hamish, Megan, and Ashley. And I also want to invite you to our next event that is going to take place on June 21st, but it's going to be in Spanish. But if you are interested in museums and COVID in Uruguay, you are very welcome. Thank you again. I will stop recording.
Thanks to the students as well. It's been a pleasure to talk about Istanbul. Thank you for the invitation.